So the second of the concepts that I mentioned was capital. For Pierre Bourdieu, capital is a word that means the types of resources that people in people or organizations or groups in any of these fields use. Oh, hold on a second. I've got to set my timer again to make sure I don't go over the YouTube limit. So capital is what Pierre Bourdieu uses to talk about the particular resources that are used in any field to try and have power. So for example, in a high school field, there is economic capital at work, what clothes you can buy. There's also something he would call embodied capital, which is your ability to show certain type of bodies or to look a certain way that has been deemed as revealing a better person or a better internal status or something that looks good. And so he would call these things capital, and they're resources that in his idea we can accrue more of, that you could actually change your embodied capital, or you could get more economic capital and therefore try and win the contest in the local field that you're operating in at any given point. And it's important to note that a lot of this, we as sociologists, we make it conscious. We think about these things, but these field struggles and these capital are all kind of mystified and work at a subconscious or unconscious level. We're just trying as analysts to see this happening. And this book that we'll get back to in a minute talks a lot about different types of capital. And finally, that funny word that I mentioned, habitus, is actually a word that dates back centuries to the medieval times, really, to talk about the propensity of humans to have kind of an unconscious process by which things routinely happen again and again in our lives. So habit. And he wants to know, well, how is it that our particular habits, our particular choices, our subjective experience in the social world, how does that actually come to be and produce objective patterns that we can study as sociologists? And so he uses this term habitus to get a sense of how the social and economic world gets inside of us in kind of a Durkheimian way, but then how we recreate the social world through this habitus. So let me say a few words on Bourdieu before I go any further. Bourdieu was born, I should have the dates here. It's in your reader that I have you reading for this week. I want to say it's like 1925. Born in a rather rural part of France, so lives through World War II as a teenager. France at this time has Algeria in northern Africa as a colony. Of course, Algeria just went through a revolution last year. Still, some would say, kind of the long played out effects of France's colonization of Algeria. So Bourdieu was kind of he was in the military in Algeria, but it was in Algeria where he really started to be able to observe and get a sense of how social systems work and how these many concepts we're talking about now, this is where he first started having kind of the inklings to some of those. What was important in his life was he was quite brilliant. He studied philosophy and social science, particularly philosophy, in France, and he was always an outsider in a lot of ways. So, for example, in France, he was a poor kid from a remote region who is clearly brilliant, makes it to the best universities in France, but he ran into, as he gets to these great universities in France that are supposed to be about equality and freedom and liberty, he ran, despite leaving those conditions of material and economic poverty, he ran into this system, the French university system, of inequality in a disguised way. So here we're all equal in our minds and equal in our abilities in a university, but he thought to himself, why is it I still feel the effects of inequality? Why is it I still feel inferior despite being in a place, an institution, a university that is supposedly about equality, that we're all on the same level once we are in this place. And it was this experience as an outsider in the university and then an outsider in Algeria, basically being a part of a French colonial army in Algeria and watching the life of the Algerians. It was these experiences as an outsider that gave him a particular way of looking at the social world and helped to develop his own sociological vision. Over the course of a very productive life, he studied a whole bunch of stuff. He studied the world of professors, and actually in kind of a devastating way showed that people like me, part of my own training process is to develop a gaze that looks out at the social world kind of from a pedestal, kind of an all-knowing gaze, and to act as if my own view of the world is the right or the objectively true view of the world. And he helped to destroy this and to help people like me to see that this is kind of a process that operates in the background and one that I should try and resist. He studied the effects of all sorts of cultural processes, technology, food selection, very different types of stuff. He had some brilliant writing on television and the way politics works in the modern world. And really by the end of his life, kind of ironically, despite being somebody who we as sociologists see as explaining the way that inequality and power gets recreated over and over and over again, by the end of his life he had something of a turn by which he started to think about how is it that as sociologists, as intellectuals, we can resist forms of domination and power in the world to create a more equitable society, whatever particular nation we live in. So he's quite an interesting character, and there was a documentary made about his life that you can look it up. I don't know where you can get it from. You might be able to actually get it through Interlibrary Loan in the library, but it's called Sociology, what's the name of it? Sociology is a Contact Sport. Which is this really kind of wonderful title that shows him engaging as a really well-known intellectual. He's kind of like the Cornel West of France, maybe. It shows him engaging in France with working class and with politicians and really kind of combating them, confronting them, using his kind of sociological vision to be in combat or in contact, a contact sport in football, engaging with forces of domination in the world around him. So let me go a little bit more in detail into these concepts again, take you a little bit through the reading as I do this, and that way you'll really understand this kind of creative way of thinking about society. You'll understand our readings, and then most importantly, you're going to really understand the Kahn book from next week. So let's revisit this idea of field. So recall that I mentioned that a field for Bourdieu is a realm of social life in which there is always a struggle for control or power of the field, and that struggle is played out through a particular resource or a particular type of capital. But importantly, a struggle in a field is always about trying to win the ability to be able to set the parameters of the game, just to literally set the rules of the game. Think about lobbyists in Congress. And by setting the rules of the game, to be able to kind of tilt the board in your favor. Bourdieu, in the first article that we read for today, calls that field to set the rules of the game. He calls it really two things. In the article for today, he called it cultural power. But in later writings after that article, he started to talk about it in this broader way of either symbolic power or also sometimes symbolic violence. And symbolic power, cultural power, as you saw in the article today, is really the power to name, quote, the rules of the game, so to write the rules of the game. He has a couple phrases in that article where he talks about the labor of representation. In other words, a lot of what goes on in fields and contested fields is trying to represent ourselves as having power. We're trying to represent what we're doing as being the most legitimate way of being. So to take you back to that high school situation again, you can think of maybe anxiety you went through, or crises you went through, or conflict you went through with other people or other social groups in your high school as a good example of kind of engaging in a field of struggle using the resources you had, whether economic or embodied, to try and kind of set the rules of what was the best in that school, or what was the most right way to look or the right way to be. And by doing that, you can basically kind of write the rules of the game and have symbolic power or cultural power over other people that are combating in that world. So you can think, for an example, and he gives a couple of examples of what he calls the power of naming. Bourdieu talks about insults. That is one way of basically asserting symbolic or cultural power in a field. And you can think, for example, I have a friend, a female graduate student who TA'd a course with a male professor, and this professor wanted, throughout a whole semester, kind of presented an image of equality with this female graduate student, had her involved in the class discussion and grading and constructing the class. But in one moment of interaction with this female revealed kind of the actual underlying symbolic power of the game, which is when at one moment when he wanted this female TA to be quiet and let him to talk, he actually reached out and touched her hand, and in this almost unconscious way. And so by touching her hand, you can imagine that happening, caused her to withdraw and quiet down and to not talk and to feel powerless, to feel subverted in this field, this classroom, as a field, a place where intellectual voice, intellectual power is kind of a form of capital. It's a resource to see who gets to talk, who talks and who doesn't get to talk. Now afterwards, these two worked it out in a series of conversations, and the male professor admitted that it was like an unconscious reaction, one he didn't mean to do when he thought about it and felt quite remorseful for afterwards. But Pierre Bourdieu would help us see that insult or that interaction, that tapping on the hand and quieting, is that power of naming the rules of the game, of kind of writing how this field is supposed to work and reminding players in the field who has power and who doesn't have power. Another example he gives in the reading of symbolic power or cultural power is the role of titles, and how titles that are given can actually change power in a field. Think the classic example, of course, is knighthood, right? The Queen's ability in England to knight, to kind of tap somebody as having a particular status, and so therefore a symbolic power that precedes the person and actually makes whatever the person's doing have more value than the actual doing that the person does, right? Because they've had this symbolic power placed on them. A good example of this for me was if you watch the show Gold Rush at all on Discovery Channel, at the end of the season they had an episode, where they talk with people, and they're talking to these guys, these blue-collar guys, non-kind of social elite guys who have worked hard, and they're asking, hey, do you think this miner, this guy's name, I'm totally blanking on the name, but it was this 18-year-old kid who was thinking about whether he should go to college or keep gold mining. And a couple of the guys said, you know what, this kid needs to go to college. And when they talked about it in a way that this college, this education would give some sort of title, some sort of symbolic power that would say something about this person. They weren't talking about it in terms of the types of skills this person would learn, but that this is what a good person would do, or this is what you should do because it shows your goodness to the world. And that's actually a great example of how this sort of symbolic power, or cultural power as Bourdieu calls it, works, and how it plays out in a field like this. Let me pause, I'll be right back.